If you want to know why facts don't change the world, why even though it's logical to stop suicidal practices of industry and economy, our world leaders do not stop. It's more than a conspiracy. It's the interdependency. It takes all aspects of you to meet the world. It takes requisite variety, sensorial versions overlapping, a million tiny hairs, and a repertoire of sounds, shapes, wrapped in memory and hiding deep below the conscious verbal world. Attach and taste each encounter, skipping across time. Where art lives, in that soil the senses are refound, reframed, remade, resung, redrawn, rewritten, rotting, and reconnecting to new organisms, new ideas. I can't remember what we talked about, but I remember the texture of your words. It's amazing how the need to eliminate confusion seems to create more confusion. Clarity is mocked by life. The way things happen in families and in nature, in love and business and the body, the way an idea comes to be, is not direct. But there's a habit of thinking it is. That habit of demanding certainty is sterilizing what might have been understood within its necessary contradictions and combinations. Singular definitions, crystallized and monotone, or lifeless graphs. Is that what's real? Or is art what's real? When you meet another person, how do you make sense of them? Do you measure them and look to their statistics? When you hear a piece of music or enter a forest, how do you make sense of it? What languages are you fluent in? The language of touch, of color, of musical expression, of metaphors, of aromas? But the thing is that we do measure people, and in doing so, erase them. And what can you read in a person or a song or a forest? Description and perception. Calligraphy of frequencies, intonations, tuning. Is there a script in the silhouettes of the forest? What am I not seeing, hearing? Where are my numbnesses? How can we describe what we cannot perceive or perceive what we cannot describe? And what is it in the world that has not been described or perceived? What tenderness has been invisible that now the sense-making, the common sense, is aching for? Are there new textures of being yet unfound? Taking in the nuance, the tones, the rhythms, the patterns, is a natural act of integrating a sea of other relational processes into you, indirectly, into you, intellectually, visually, emotionally, culturally, physically, into your memory, your belly, your family. I am not somehow outside of art. There's no way to breathe or eat or love or move your body or take part in a culture or drive a car or pet a dog without doing it. Art. I do not make sense alone. I make more than one sense. You have several that cross, overlap, mix and merge. Your sense-making changes as other contextual information comes in. Time. You are not only you, I am not only me. And if something new is to become, it will become in the eye of the needle. Not necessarily in me, not necessarily in the world, but rather this elusive change that the survival of our species and so many others depends upon is in the possible shift of how I see myself in the world, how you see yourself in the world. What world? What self? And that is where art lives, in the possible.
The man bent over his guitar, a shearsman of sorts. The day was green. They said, "You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." The man replied, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar." And they said then, "But play you must, a tune beyond us, yet ourselves, a tune upon the blue guitar of things exactly as they are."
Where the meaning-making is alive, not concrete. Where the alchemy of information is always stirring in history, language, pain, desire, humor, beauty, rage. A baby cries, a cat purrs, a tear streams down a friend's cheek. Where do we understand these things? They are not pluckable statistics. They are not direct. What if the caterpillar was looking for a way to design sustainable, everlasting caterpillarness? Because it could not imagine, because of course it can't imagine, what it is as a butterfly.
Hello, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Elizabeth Carney. I'm the chair of the club's Business and Leadership Forum and your host for today. Our inner ecology is all about shifting how we think, a conversation with Nora Bateson in conversation with Gil Friend. We invite our audience to listen to us on the internet at commonwealthclub.org to learn about many of the fine programs that are here at the club. We have another one coming up on May 7th with Rupa Mara in conversation with Donna LaSala, First Do No Harm, Civic Leadership and the Role of Healthcare. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers. Nora Bateson is a filmmaker, as you have experienced, a writer, an educator, president of the International Bateson Institute, director and producer of An Ecology of Mind, a portrait of her father, Gregory Bateson. Her work brings the fields of biology, cognition, art, anthropology, psychology, and information technology together into a study of the patterns of language and ecology and living systems. Her book, Small Arcs of Larger Circles, is a revolutionary personal approach to the study of systems and complexity. She's studied at UC Santa Cruz. She lives in Sweden, and we're happy to have her here today. She'll be in conversation with Gil Friend, an expert in residence, Presidio Graduate School, CEO of Natural Logic, CEO of Critical Path Capital, and former Chief Sustainability Officer of the City of Palo Alto. Here to have a stimulating dialogue, we welcome our speakers. Please come on up.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Nora, for coming all this way.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to all of you for coming and all of you who are out there on the airwaves as well.
So I've been thinking for a while about having a series of conversations with interesting people that we were calling conversations at the edge of now. And I'm delighted that the first one is with you and an opportunity to share with a wider audience the conversation you and I have been having together over the last year or so. You're a filmmaker, you're a poet. You might not say so, but a poet who puts into words things that cannot be put into words. So I'll say that about you. You're a mother. You're heir to a remarkable multi-generational family business that has had a profound influence on my own life and work. So I'm delighted to have this chance to talk together in the open.
Thank you, Gil. And it's, I think that I would like to start also by recognizing your work and your history coming into this and the many decades of dedication toward sustainable living in all ways, business and living in our daily lives and so on and so forth, and in societies and towns and how we put this together. So I think it's safe to sort of say we're both here today after a long journey with a lot of frustration in it, a lot of love, and unending dedication, and deep concern. I think we wouldn't be sitting here today, and neither would any of you, if we weren't at a moment of really wondering how do we go further from here. It's not like the ideas of ecology and sustainability are new. So what new things can we bring into the conversation today? Where can we push this that I think, both of us have been traversing in the territory long enough to have gained some familiarity with nuance that it would be good to share.
So let's start with some recognition of where we are, some appreciation of where we are, because we're in the midst of a cultural and economic shift in the world that's got great momentum to it. The Green New Deal is on the table. The children's movement is rising around the world. Renewable energy proliferating rapidly all over the planet. China has declared a national policy of becoming an ecological civilization. Great momentum that we can take some comfort and pride in, and yet we all know that it's deeply inadequate. We talk about it being inadequate because it's not big enough or fast enough, or effectively challenging the other forces that are contending against that. But one of the things that we've explored is that it's not enough because of how we even approach the fundamental questions. What do we think about? How do we speak about it? What questions do we ask? So let me start with a question that we've shared and we put up on the website. How do we think our way through the messes that we're in when the way we think is part of the mess?
Yes. Let's start there. That's a good crunchy piece to start with. Yeah.
So let's unpack that a little bit first.
Let's think about that. And I think for me, that question really has a lot of different contextual process going on in it. To begin with, there is this notion of self. And where is the edge of the self? How can our language and understanding even of self begin to expand in a way that changes our relationship to context. So, if I have this idea that I end at my skin, then that is a kind of justification for a lot of the behavior and the sense-making, the logic of where we are right now. I am me, I exist in this body and my bank account and my political views and my family and my address, my tax identification number. That's me. And if that's really me, then a great deal of what we're seeing in terms of structures and patterns is logical. I should do what I can to substantiate that level of me.
Well, at a certain level, it's not just logical, it's biological. You are an organism designed to survive, to do what it needs to do to survive, with whatever awareness it brings to that challenge. But go on.
The thing is, that's not the edge of me.
Right.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Or the possibility. I would say really the possibility. So the edge of me might be better drawn in much blurrier lines. So where's the edge of my microbiome's interaction with the ecology? Where's the edge of the ideas that I play with? Where's the edge of the language that I'm using? What about my family and my children? Are they the edge of me? Or is it my community, my culture, my epistemological frames? Where's the edge of me? And in that kind of a question, there's an expansion into the possibility of recognizing the self in context in another way. So for me, there's been a big sort of opening around not necessarily coming from the self-help movement of, the change begins from within, but recognizing that the change is in noticing how we see ourselves in our contexts and in relationship, in the interdependency that we exist within. And that in that space, there's a whole ripe composting ecology of movement, where otherwise we might see stuckness.
There's something that opens there with this new sense of the self. It's all the things you said. It's also what we care about and how we orient ourselves in the world based on what we care about, either explicitly or implicitly. There's how we listen for the cares of others who may seem different, but actually share deep concerns. We get trapped in the language and the ideology and the physical appearance and miss the commonality that's there. And lest this sound abstract and philosophical, this is also biological. As we are sitting here today, as we're sitting here with all of you, we're sharing pheromones in the air. We're actually in real time modifying each other's neurochemistry and neurobiology, laying down new patterns in our nervous systems physiologically in the consequence of the conversations that we have. So it opens up and it raises the question of what kind of conversations do we have? Because in the ways that we speak, both with each other, but also in the interior dialogues that we have.
The nonverbal
And the interior, the chatter in my own head and the chatter in your own head, we're creating worlds in every moment. And those are worlds of possibility or not. We open or close possibilities. We coordinate with each other. We find common purpose with each other. This is what we do in our organizations, which, as you know, has been my focus for the last several decades, is how do we enable the organizations that are a feature of our landscape as humans now. We don't just live with trees and critters and streams and mountains. We live with, companies and government agencies and financial institutions and communal organizations, which we've already had, in which we interact and coordinate through the requests that we make of each other, the promises that we make of each other, implicitly or explicitly. There we are. That's the clay that we work with as human beings. That's where human culture gets shaped. So how do we do that? And, in particular, how do we do that in these institutions that seem to have other purposes of their own, separate from the concerns of humans and life on the planet?
I think that we should address the ghost. And it's the ghost of mechanism, the ghost of industry, the ghost of the engineering plan that is drawn. It's the ghost that inhabits our understanding of causality. Mm-hmm. And that is a tricky, slippery, sneaky little ghost. Because it creeps in when you don't think it's creeping in. And so, I work with a lot of different groups of people. I work with family therapists, but I also work with ecologists, and I work with educators, and I work with artists, and I work with ecologists and change makers, and I work with coaches and economists and all kinds of people, anyone who's working with systems. And one of the things that I keep seeing everywhere I go is this kind of lurking metaphor that the system that is being considered, whether it's a family or an ocean or an organization or an economy, gets considered with these very mechanistic ideas that this part is going to relate to that part and that part's going to make this part change. And together they either create functional or non-functional, dysfunctional processes or systems. And it's not like that in life.
No.
The body's not like that. The family's not like that. The ecology's not like that. And so there's a really deep and profound miss in the synchronization of what it is to survive in our world, because we're sort of surviving in two simultaneous ecologies. One is an ecology of our institutions and our cultural ideas of economy, and all those institutions need each other, right? The education system is connected to the employment world, is connection to the health, is connection to political frameworks, and so on and so forth. And those institutions are completely interdependent. They can't get extracted from each other. Try to change one and the others will pull it back. How many beautiful curricula have you seen put into schools? And then pretty soon all the parents are saying, yeah, but how's my kid going to get into college and get a job in the world that doesn't support these beautiful ideas, right? And that's the ecology of the culture kind of pulling back at this change you try to make in the level of the institution of education. So this lurking industrial mechanical metaphor, I think is also important to look at in terms of what kind of sense making our institutions can do. If we think of them as receivers of particular kinds of information, all right, what kind of information can an education system take in? And what kind of information can a health system begin to receive? And what kind of information can a legal system perceive? And if you start to look at the very specific kinds of information and contexts, language, that those institutions can take in, you start to see how decontextualized and deeply non-complex. So the reductionism is inherent in the actual institutional process, in the industrialization of the way that these things can make sense. So, a teacher may see, for example, that a child's behavior is maybe connected to causation that reach well beyond the rules and regulations of the classroom. They might be connected to family or food or economy in the larger society, or health issues that go back generations, or all sorts of, complex causalities. And the teacher may very well see that. But the way in which it's possible for the teacher to receive that information and communicate it is only in terms of particular diagnostics of test scores and behavioral descriptions. And then they're completely decontextualized. So then the response to that information is also decontextualized. So the kid may then get diagnosed with a behavior disorder or a biochemical disorder based on that behavior. And there's no way to look across contexts and to begin to become familiar with that child's complexity.
And it's not just the awareness that the teacher has, but the moves that she or he has available to them within the structures that we're in. I think you've named one of the hearts of the problem, the mechanistic and reductionist view of the world, the notion that we can take things down into parts, work on the parts individually, make something happen with that. It works on a billiards table. Works extremely well on a billiards table. It works well if you're repairing your car. I was telling you this morning that 30 years ago, I dropped the clutch out of an old Volvo, repaired it myself. There were clear procedures, there were clear tools, there was a sequence to do. If I did it right, it worked. Very satisfying. The world of living things and living systems and human beings and all that is not like that, not just within our bodies, but within our interactions with each other. And so to build on what you said, it's both that we literally cannot perceive things, blinded by our own preconceptions, by our own histories, by the ways that we've learned to think, because all of us bring our histories with us, right, all the time. What we see, what we're aware of, the possibilities that we see or don't see, all constrained there. And then, we've built up institutions that are very effective in the mechanistic model, but that fail this test of context. Let me give you a real world example, very different in some ways from the one that you just shared. We've been working with a wonderful group of people looking at the challenge of sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay region. How do we adapt to that? How do we pay for that? How do we build the strategies, both financial and political and cultural, to ready ourselves for something that is big and largely inevitable and of a scale of impact that we really don't understand? In this room of some of the best people around, we're looking at specific projects, and the projects are by their nature complex and integrated, multifaceted, multi-aspect, because you can't do this without that. You can't raise a levee for one city facing the bay and think you've solved the problem, because that just moves the water to the next city north and south. So there has to be an integrated and systemic solution. Looking at some of these creative and imaginative projects that have been designed, one of the people, very seasoned in the working of state politics, said, well, what we need to do now is we need to take a project, cut it up into its component pieces. For each piece, find the agency or the existing program that's oriented to that piece and that has a funding stream for that piece, and fund that piece. And then do that with the next one. And the hope is that over time you build a mosaic of these pieces that ultimately stitches together. And I was about to open my mouth. Unfortunately, the head of the finance subcommittee said, wait a minute, that will not work. Because the fundamental of this is the integration. And so all of a sudden there's this recognition in the room, which the room kind of quickly rushed past, but the recognition in the room that the tools that we have for deciding and funding and building and managing projects are unable to engage and manage the complexity. Let me just take it one step further. We know that many of these projects have multiple benefits. They will protect against rising seas, but they will also enhance wetlands and enhance wildlife and perhaps provide jobs, and the list goes on. We don't have a tool to assess the multiple benefits. So you can't do the fundamental financial analysis of return on investment. Is this a good place to put our money in return for what we're going to get from it? You can't do the analysis with any accuracy. We all know that there's an enormous cost of inaction, of not dealing with this possible future of rising tides. We don't have any way of incorporating the cost of inaction into the financial analyses. So in a way, we're like that old joke about the a guy comes out of a bar, sees someone on the sidewalk on his hands and knees crawling around, and asks them, "What are you doing there?" Says, "I'm looking for my keys." Well, is this where you lost your keys? He said, "No, I lost them across the street." "Why aren't you looking across the street?" "Well, because the light's better here."
But that's exactly the situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm seeing this everywhere I go.
Yeah.
And even I would like to just say, that to have social workers who are considered to be in charge of social problems. Mm-hmm. Ecological activists are taking action on climate change. Economists are rethinking the economy to deal with wealth gap. And this is all best case scenario. And at one level, there's nothing wrong with this. Okay, let's don't throw reductionism out completely, because it does have its benefits.
If I have a broken bone, I want a surgeon who's a good mechanic to repair my bone.
That's right. I mean, I want my plane from Sweden to arrive here.
You bet.
In one piece.
Yeah.
But also, there's something to be said for expertise.
Yeah.
It's just that expertise without contextual and transcontextual understanding and familiarity increases blindness. It doesn't decrease it. And so that's an issue. So I have been at numerous ecological and climate change meetings lately, because the climate has really gotten more into the public discourse in the last year than it has been in the past. And it's interesting to me that there's this kind of assumption that climate change is going to happen to a bunch of healthy, happy, relatively mentally stable people. I don't think so.
Even if we are now, which is already in question.
Which is already a question. So how are these things connected? And where's the link between environmental and mental health? That kind of a conversation needs to be really supported.
It breaks at even more fundamental and, in theory, easier levels. So when I was building the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan for the city of Palo Alto with dozens of people working on this process, I remember one week we were at the city council talking about the climate plan and the general plan for the city. And the agenda for that week was transportation. And in the course of the conversation, one of the people testifying at the mic talked about how in order to talk about transportation effectively, you need to talk about housing and where the housing is and the access to public transportation from housing, et cetera. You guys understand the story. And one of the council members, who is a good person and who really cares about this stuff, said, "Well, this week we're focusing on transportation. Next week we're going to talk about housing." And I just about went and hit my head against the wall, because I knew that next week when we were talking about housing, if someone brought up the connection of transportation and housing, they would have been told, "Sorry, we talked about transportation last week." Now, at a certain level, that's a desperate attempt to manage, I'm putting air quotes, manage the complexity of this, because it's hard to think about everything all at once. But at the same time, it's a recipe for utter failure.
I think it might be harder not to.
But it doesn't feel harder to people. So why is that, and how does that shift?
I think it's at a couple of different levels.
Were you always this way, or was there a point in your life where you've noticed that you were seeing the world differently than you had before?
I think it's a question of authorization. Because ultimately, it's not like complexity is really that hard. We all do it all day, every day. You cannot engage in a conversation. You can't walk across a room. You can't eat a meal. You can't hug your child. You can't do anything.
Drive your car without thinking about anything that you're doing, by the way, while you're doing it, right? So yeah, there's the mastery.
Okay, so the thing is that it's not like we don't do this.
Yeah. We
do it. We just don't know. We're not noticing how much we already know about being in the complexity of life and applying that to other things. So So for me, the question then becomes how to authorize this, because one of the issues is that.
Let me stop you there, Nora. What do you mean by that?
I'm about to tell you that.
Good. I bet you are.
Okay. Because there are experts. All right. And someone has put their life into that housing department, and they've done their PhD on housing, and they have been working in housing for decades, and they know that housing world inside and out. But they haven't been ever exposed to the ins and outs of the transportation world. And so what we have in our boardrooms and in our strategy meetings and in our moments of dealing with acute problems is this authorization of experts who need to tell us exactly what they know. Now, I have nothing wrong with expertise. I think that that's great. But what they're not allowed to do is go off territory. And their career depends upon it. Their sense of self is very much built into a particular set of expert knowledge, history and trainings. So the question that I have is, how do we generate context for mutual learning between experts? How do we open up the language so that there's speculation? And how do we bring in the experience of people as people? Right? Because it may be that housing expert knows so much about housing. But my guess is she also gets to work somehow. She also takes the bus, takes the BART, drives the car, rides with someone, has been in a carpool lane, knows. It's not like we don't all exist in this multi-contextual world, right? I am the education system. I am the political system. I am the economy. I am the housing. I am the transportation world. We are all of those things. And yet the authorization for that personal experience, the personal voice, the understanding and the knowing that reaches beyond professional expertise is desperately needed now. And some kind of holding of that doesn't look like, okay, the interdisciplinary panel. Can we just talk about that for a second? Because, how many interdisciplinary panels have you been on? And it's like channel surfing. It's not like mutual learning at all. Nobody goes off their script. And what you don't get a sense of is the intimate knowing of the people who are speaking, who are bringing themselves to the actual conversation. They have lives and history and pain and intuition and sensitivities, and they know what it smells like in the BART at night. That matters. And so how do we bring that kind of intimate, transcontextual, mutual learning into whatever those rooms are where we're trying to figure out how to deal with the emergencies of this time?
So, in the panels at the conferences and in the meeting rooms in the city government or the corporation, we have not just habits, but we have structures, political and economic structures that have been accreted over the years to do this thing. You look at the economics of conferences, they are now filled up with panels of people talking for a very short time to give you a program that's full enough so that you can charge enough to make the economics of the conference work. So people call me up and say, will you fly across the country to have 3 minutes on a panel? No, sorry. You look inside the organizations, and what you call authorization evokes for me both authority and authorship. So the authority says, this is how it is, this is how it has to work. We've designed these systems to be this way, to enable accountability for the things that we think are important, which leaves out, of course,
most of everything.
That can be in very explicit terms of who's at the meeting. or very implicit terms about you just know what you're not supposed to say in certain settings, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of a design for effectiveness. But, authority is always granted as well as taken, right? Even the authority of a soldier or police officer who's got a weapon. Your father pointed out that the use, talking about force in human affairs is very different than in physics. Someone has the choice of saying, I will yield to your threat or not. Gandhi, great example, where people, by asserting authority in the face of authority, something new happened. And so there's something about both how people assert authority and how it is then acknowledged and raised up by people saying, yeah, that actually speaks to me. So, as you know, this is the thing that I grapple with in my work all the time, is how do we move these historic ossified institutions that grew a certain way for a certain reason? How do we move them in the current time? In my work, I've usually tried to listen to what the existing concerns are, both the explicit ones, we need to make quarterly revenue targets, and the implicit ones about how people feel, what they talk about socially, what matters to them individually, and to try to find in that some opening that says, here's a way to connect these. In the crassest terms, in the business consulting that we do, here's how you might be able to be successful financially while being a better steward of the planet and a better citizen in your community. Commonly, and this has been a challenge throughout this work, people think that you have to choose one or the other, that they're antithetical. You either make money or you make sense, not both. If you want to make more money, you're going to make less sense. If you want to make more sense, you're going to make less money. And part of the work that we do, and frankly, and Presidio Graduate School is one of the places doing this work, is to say, no, it's actually not true. Here's examples, here's how, here's ways that you can actually bring your concerns, oh my gosh, as an entire human being, into your work. And not only will you feel better, maybe your work will even be more successful. But that's it's a slow, difficult process. It's kind of bespoke. Rather than something pervasive in the culture still, even among the companies that are the leaders in this work.
For sure.
So let's talk about, we're talking a lot about the problem, the challenge. Where have we seen successful examples of this kind of opening, where something new emerges, where some possibility that wasn't there before arises in an organization, a government body, a culture? Where do we see that?
Well, I think if we go looking for those successes, go looking with a different set of binoculars.
Yeah.
Because if you go looking for...
Seeing through the eyes, not with the eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Because what I'm afraid we're going to do is say, all right, what we want to find is successful examples of organizational process that developed in ways that were measurably, accountably more beneficial to community and ecology while making profit. Okay? And what concerns me about that is the lens. That's a lens that's already attached and already informed across hundreds of years of sense-making around community, around what is the biosphere, around what is success. So there's already a lot of cultural blind spots built in. And if I'm going to come into this with sort of this warm data idea, which is the idea that we need to be looking for contextual and transcontextual relational information, that if you want to understand complexity, if we want to respond better to the complexity of our times, that we've got to have another kind of information, another whole, if you will, species of information that doesn't look or walk or talk like normal data, but that is relational. that's going to actually lead us to find things we didn't know we were looking for. So the success you might find is in some other aspect entirely of either the community or the biosphere or, whatever it is, that it's not where you thought it was. So my friend Molly Jan was talking about this the other day, and she does food security. And she was working with a group of people who were addressing a crisis of nutrition in a group of HIV/AIDS patients in several different cities. And they were, counting all the nutrition issues, and all the doctors were working, trying to find, build supplements and find a solution. And they were thinking about delivery of food, and they were trying to come up with all kinds of different processes. And then they actually started talking to the people and to their partners and friends. And it turned out that because the medications they were taking were making their hair fall out, they didn't want to go to the store. So what they did was they had wigs brought in. Okay, now let me just say that no matter how focused you are on the nutritional measurements and the nutritional successes, it's not going to lead you to see the wigs.
Yeah.
So this is really an important piece of this question that you're asking, because the way in which we go looking for success stories is not going to look like we think it looks. And I really just want to make a space for that now. I want to authorize that sort of looking, that's looking in the indirect across contexts. And I could tell you several different stories that and I'm sure you could too, of various. A friend of mine was working in solar work, and one of the things that came out of their putting solar panels in some African villages was that the girls could do their homework after dark. So again, it's that would normally be a statistic or a piece of data that would come out in regards to education, but not necessarily in regards to alternative energy. And so this is why it's so important to be bringing these things together, because it's not like, okay, even my friends in working in systemic work are inclined to do this, to say, okay, this is a system, it's complex, we have to take lots of different aspects into consideration. So we're going to list the stakeholders, and we're going to map the system, and we're going to see how they all come in and make it work. And that's pretty good.
It's better than not.
It's better than not. But there's a big piece missing there.
You mean like talking with those people?
It's the question not of what is the list of stakeholders, but what's the relationship between them? And that is a question that is qualitative. That's a question of affect. It's a question of aesthetic. And that matters so much. And in order to get to that information, we need to be able to communicate in new ways. We've got to get off the script, out of the tones of particular kinds of rational discussion and into more intimate details.
So you're coming to another of the hearts of the challenge here, I think. Yes, we need to be able to see differently. We need to be able to listen differently, not just hear the sounds, but listen to what the meaning is there and form our own relationships with people. It's a different kind of information. It's something humans have always known how to do, but in the modern times, we're forgetting that rapidly. Our institutions certainly don't know how to do it. And we can.
I would go further. I would say they're actually designed not to.
They're designed not to. I would speculate that one of the reasons is that they're designed for predictability and replicability.
And efficiency.
And efficiency and scale. Anybody who lives in the Bay Area where we are knows that if you have a business idea and you pitch it, the first question you get is, will it scale? maybe that's not the most important question about a business.
Oh, don't get me started on that.
But there that is. But no, well, we'll crank it up a little bit here. So you have institutions designed to do something else that don't know how, institutions and people that don't know how. Let's just a side bow to your father, who, when someone was talking with him about corporations as people, and we all know this story, but this is back in, I think, 1972 that Gregory was saying this. He said, look, this is, fundamental error. Corporations are not people. The person said, yeah, they're collections of people. He said, no, they're not collections of people. They're collections of parts of people.
You see,
really big difference, right?
That's a really big difference. And that's the difference that leads to the kind of sense-making that drops people off at the justification for what is going on in the world at, I was just doing my job.
But it's not, yes, but not just doing my job. It's, I was just living my life. So we are all culprits in this.
That's right.
Does anybody here have an investment account, a retirement account? Do you ever look at your returns? Do you ever pay attention to what the quarterly returns are? You may be concerned about social responsibility and environmental responsibility and so forth, but some part of you, and I'm going to say this about you because I know it's true about me, is looking at the numbers. So there's the personal instantiation of what is structured into the economy. How do we learn? How do we cultivate in ourselves the capacity? Maybe it's a better word than learning, because it's not like learning, open up my head and give me more facts, listen to these people on stage telling me things, but it's how does my capacity to listen and learn in response change? Mm-hmm. We've all experienced that. Certainly those of us who are musicians or athletes or working with small children know that you see a process of indirect, not linear cause and effect, but indirect actions and cultivation and a growth in capacity. How do we do that? Both as, co-conspirators in this problem. You and I were talking this morning that observed that every garment that you and I are both wearing now, and I'll speculate for probably most of you in the room, is a product of exploitation.
At several different levels.
At several different levels. And, here we are conscious, dedicated, committed, and yet we're in it. Mm-hmm. At almost every level of our lives. And we can buy organic and we can recycle and do good things, but we're enmeshed in this global system that has gone way, way off the rails.
Let's talk about
open something else
the
up.
Language for a second.
Good.
Because you used the word enmeshed, and I like that word.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to kind of go into this for a second, because when I was a kid, it wasn't really possible to talk about ecologies in the way that we do now. In fact, interconnected was still a word that was kind of like, I wonder what that means. That kind of hurts my head if it's interconnected. And then
hurting your head is a good metric to watch for.
Yeah.
We want you to feel like your head is hurting.
But in the word interconnected, there is still a hangover.
Yes.
There's still a hangover of dots connected by lines. And still we're looking at the dots and the lines. And when you start to think, what are we going to do? And you're looking at something that is interconnected by dots and lines, you have this sense that the doing that you can partake in is the manipulation of the dots and the lines, that you can get in there and wiggle them around. Okay. Yeah. Now, when we think about it at the next level, we start to think about interdependency. That's another thing. What do you think of when you start to think about interdependency? You think about whatever, a tide pool, a forest, a family, right? You can't really get in there and wiggle stuff around with that same sense of engineering that you might, if you could have just dots and lines. That was much easier. I've got a slide with a cricket standing on a log that's covered in moss, and there's a decomposing leaf in a forest, and it's interdependency. How do you participate in the interdependency when you're in it with it? Which I think is the question we kind of started off with.
Well, it's the question we keep coming back to, and I'll say it again, is how do we move with something that starts to resemble wisdom in recognition of this interdependency is better than interconnected, but not even strong enough, right?
So the word that I'm using now,
Yeah.
because I still feel like there's this idea that everything's kind of put together like Legos. And if you want to do something in the world, you have to rearrange the Legos. But now the word that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about how complexity and systemics are actually happening is this word intersteeping, which is, I don't think was really a word, but it's a word that
is now.
I'm using.
I authorize you.
Oh, thank you. I needed that. But because there's no way to pull the thing apart again.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the issue, is we can't pull that child out of what it's learned from its family or his culture or her classroom or her sense of self or her siblings or his relationship with technology. You can't get that out of the child and somehow fix it and put it back in again. Yeah. It's just not like that. You can't get the grapes out of the wine. You can't get the salt out of the broth. You can't pull the systems apart and fix them and put them back together again. So
intersteeping.
It's been intersteeping for a long time.
It reminds me of a wonderful phrase from the great Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who talks about interdependent co-arising, which
Beautiful.
is, I think, a similar concept. And how do we live into that? How do we move in that? If the assumption is that we're in a world of interdependent co-arising, rather than a world of separate parts in a machine, how do we stand? How do we live? How do we move? It's going to be different if that's present to us. And maybe that's where it starts, is to have it be present to each of us in wherever we go, whatever we do, whomever we speak with and interact with, and see what happens.
I think it's the first step is to notice that. And from that, the last thing I would want to do is to prescribe some sort of scalable formula for how to respond to intersteeping. I think that would be disastrous. But because there is a sense of an increased multisensorial sensitivity that needs to be actually explored and developed.
And experienced.
In
your own physical body. Because these are things that you're actually, much older than the mechanistic metaphors of the last 500 years. This is what we've done for millennia in this instrument, right? I want to say a word in defense of scale, having slammed it before.
I didn't even slam it yet. You didn't even give me a chance.
Keep going then. I'll wait. I'll wait.
Go ahead, defend it. Then I'll have more ammo.
I want to defend a very different kind of scale. So, the metaphor around here is the vertical scale of grow fast, be a billion-dollar company in no time at all. There's what I think of as the horizontal scale of the federated small, which is going wide, not going high. The networks and relationships, steeping, the steeping not just in the cup, but steeping that steeps out all over the landscape. Because ultimately, we are talking about scale of a kind. We're in a planetary culture. We may see breakdowns in this century, but we're likely to be planetary culture for a long, long time to come. The solutions can't be local. It's ironic. They have to be local, but they can't be just local. So I think there's a kind of scale that we want, a kind of rippling effect, a kind of pervasiveness in the culture.
I think what you're talking about, I would describe as patterns of interaction. And that the patterns of interaction that are in place now, there's these patterns. When we need to get medicine, we go to the drugstore, we get a call from the doctor, we tell our friends we're, dealing with something, they might bring us soup. We have a day off from work. There's a whole sort of pattern of interaction that crosses lots of different contexts, right? Yeah. And how those patterns of interaction shift is, I think, a really important question.
Well, how they shift and how they spread, and it may be that the word scale has too much baggage right now. So maybe spread or something else, or maybe even a more biological metaphor might be more appropriate there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that are floating around in the trendy linguistics of change making right now, the semantics of change making. That, one is that sort of as the opposite of competitive capitalism, we need to have collaboration and collective intelligence. I think that's a mistake.
Say why?
Isn't capitalism and the idea that we're in a competition with each other a form of collective intelligence and collaboration as it is? I mean, most of the great
so it's not that you're opposed to collaboration and collective intelligence. It's that those distinctions don't bring us anything new that we need in the context of global capitalism.
I would be very careful assuming that collaboration and collective intelligence are the opposite of competition and capitalism.
Right. Clear.
Be very careful with that because, I mean, after all, wasn't Nazi Germany a product of collaboration and collective intelligence? So we have to be careful what it is we're collecting on. And that's, I think, really a necessary thing to be aware of.
So this requires an awareness of the background, right? That, any conversation that we have, the requests and promises that I talked about before, or in the context of an assumed for the sake of what? Will you do X? Well, why? Why do I want that? Why might you want that? That's always there. It's usually unstated. Maybe it's useful to bring that out on the table. So it's collaboration for the sake of what? For global commercial enterprise, or for global human well-being? And where do we go with that?
I think there's a lot of people for whom those would be one and the same.
Sure.
So, tread carefully in that territory because it's not as easy as it sounds. And I think for me, this is the ultimate issue with scale, is that what scale, the idea of scale is attached to, is a deeply colonial metaphor. That has to do with some kind of notion of, well, we are the ones who can make, the world better. And so what we have to do is come up with a formula that is a cookie cutter set of patterns. And then we just have to stamp it all over the world. And bingo, we're going to save the world. And, that's what colonialism is.
Sure.
So
but if we look at scale in living systems, which is where I take most of my teaching from, I look to the 3.8 billion years of open source R&D that's been done by the world's living systems, that are efficient and resilient and adaptive and productive. And, there's the playbook for most of how I look at things. There we see the processes of evolution and of succession and of ecosystem succession and of species rising and growing and, spreading over the landscape in the context of these interrelationships. So they are bounded and limited, never in complete runaway for very long. So I hear what you're saying about scale in the colonial industrialist economic context, but ideas do grow and spread.
They do indeed. Yeah. And it's more just that question of how do we begin to pay attention to where these blind spots are? Because it might seem, there's so much right now that might seem like a good idea. And there's a lot of urgency to run out and do good because there's, tick tock, we're at the edge and we've come too far and not enough has been done and not enough attention has been paid. But I think it's absolutely imperative to pay attention to what kind of attention we're paying.
Bingo.
And, before we go rushing in thinking this is going to be a good deed, there's a whole lot of humility that needs to find its way to the surface.
So this is part of our dilemma, is we dare not rush into action. We also don't have the luxury of inaction. We have to find some kind of dance between those that is grounded in humility, that's open and attentive, that notices what we are bringing to our conversations and to what we notice. And back to the question of warm data, I think for me, one of the questions is, how do we keep data warm in the day-to-day context in organizations and life and relationships? How can a world of parts learn to glimpse the whole a little bit more and more here, there, and then work from there and toward there? So I think it's a good time to open up to the room, hear what questions we've provoked here, but maybe you have one other thing you want to say first.
I just wanted to say that I think that recognizing our own complexity is a really good start. If you start to think of yourself, or I start to think of myself as more than, some guest person in here to speak with you today. Okay, I'm a mom, I'm a daughter, I'm a, product of the 80s punk rock generation. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a lover of cooking. There's so much that is in the complexity of who I am when I'm speaking with you. And if I can begin to recognize that complexity and to speak from that complexity, to explore that complexity, then I might, it's possible, I might be able to perceive a little more of your complexity, a little more complexity of the world around me. And in that perception, I might be able to be more careful and rigorous and generous. I might have more integrity. And that's what I would be after, is that kind of generosity and integrity in perception.
And in the doing of that each of us does, we're an invitation to everybody else that we're interacting with for them to do that too. There's another kind of authorization, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And to learn.
Yeah.
And so now let's open it up for questions.
I want to remind our audience here at the Commonwealth Club and on the radio that we are listening to Nora Bateson, president of the International Bateson Institute, with Gil Friend in conversation about our inner ecology. It's all about shifting how we think. So while you're lining up at the microphone to ask your questions, which you can adjust in terms of how tall or short you are, and also in terms of interlacing boy, girl, I would get to ask the first question myself.
Okay.
So thank you for both of you for being here today. And I just want to take some baby steps forward from where you've brought us, so that it's not about the list of stakeholders, and it's not about what it is that they each do. Take us a couple more steps into what you see as a listening process.
Well, for me, that process has to do with a kind of inquiry that reaches across multiple contexts. And it's something that I actually grew up doing. So it's something that I didn't really realize I was doing until I started to realize that maybe everybody else around me wasn't doing that, and that they didn't understand the kind of conclusions that I was coming to, which seemed off topic very often. And so I developed a process called a warm data lab that I've been working with in all over the world, actually, to help and to work with groups of people to create a transcontextual sense-making experience, and to address complex questions with groups of people toward that. So those are some processes on a practical level that I use.
Just as a follow-up to that, And just as a follow-up to that, then how do you keep those ghosts that you mention from taking over your warm data inquiry?
Well, they won't in the lab process because it's kind of ghost-proof. But but they sure do sneak into my head and into my sense-making. And the only thing that I can do is just keep an eye out. And catch myself. I mean, we all do it all the time. It's impossible not to. Look at our language provides the structure for us to divide things into nouns and separate them. And then, sort of collective understandings of causality, it just creeps in. So we just have to be aware that those blind spots are there.
This is why practice is so important, and the process of cultivation that I talked about before. We learn by doing. You learn by experiencing, seeing what happened, trying it again, sometimes battling with ghosts. A similar related story, my former colleague Bill Reed, architect, was working with a community back east where a well-regarded private school was wanting to expand and do the greenest possible school building anyone had ever done at that time. They were excited, they were enthusiastic, and they were stunned that their neighbors started lawyering up and saying, "You're not going to do this here." And, so you had the prospect of a community going at war with itself, and they brought Bill in, and he gathered everybody in the room, everybody being, without dots and lines, but, the school, the administrators, architects, students, teachers, neighbors, builders, zoning regulators, everybody that touched this in some way, and asked people how they felt about this project. And people declared their positions. I'm for it, I'm against it, I hate it, I love it. Went around the room and then went around again and asked, well, why is that your position? And people explained their position, and he went around again, asking again and again for the reasons behind the statements, trying to get at for the sake of what that was there in that community. It took a couple of days to go through the whole process, at the end of which everybody looked around the room and said, holy mackerel, we actually all care about the same things. We all want, a safe and vital community for the kids. We all want these things. And Bill said, okay, now let's start the design process. And the outcome was completely different. What they had started with was an impressively ecological building. And what they wound up with something that was twice as good. That's where they even started, with the complete buy-in of the community, with people not going at war with each other. And speaking of metrics in the world of quantitative metrics, a county that hadn't given a zoning variance in 10 years gave them a zoning variance in 2 months.
We should send them to deal with Brexit.
Might be a little late.
Okay, let's see if we can move through some of our question line. So try to be aware of your ghosts and ask questions, not too many comments. And let's see if we can't give a few people an opportunity to ask.
Thank you. My name is Jan Ballard with commons.org and financialscoreboards.com. And I grew up with Bob Greenleaf's receptive listening work in my family, so I relate. And I just want to say that the feeling in this room for me, I haven't had in decades. So I just want to appreciate both of you for your thoughtfulness and your articulateness and all that. And I've had so many things come up in the discussion, but I'm reminded of my discussions with Doug Engelbart, who was a friend that I knew at the end of his life, who coined the term collective intelligence. And his sadness that his bootstrapping process that he used at SRI to do everything we do with computers he never could replicate it after the Augmentation Research Center. And I just throw this out because I'm hearing the mechanism, in some of your critiques to Gil, I'm hearing the mechanistic thoughts that you have. And so I want to throw out something, which is that in the last couple of conversations with Doug, I said, well, Doug, what would have happened? Because it was triple loop learning, right, that he was doing. That's what he was showing, and that most people don't do, and he couldn't get it to happen again. What if you had done a little measurement as the fourth loop? And Jim Sporer actually has been my mentor also and has put this out, that the fourth loop was missing. But the measurement is the last thing that you do, not the first thing. And I think maybe there's something in that. And Doug, in our last lunch, I said, Doug, I think that bootstrapping will go viral when we add the measurement piece, which will be different if you've done the 3 loops. And I think it might be more in the vein of what we're talking about. So I'll throw that out to you as a thought. If bootstrapping, if the 4th loop,
depending, Jan, on what you choose to measure.
Well, I'm saying that the choices to measure will be different because you do that. But I just love your thoughts on that, Nora.
You know, what it comes down to for me is, what world are you perceiving? And so if we're perceiving a world in which, you know, we can measure housing outcomes, then we will continue to do that. You know, it's really, I think the question is how to ask the better question, because if we end up chasing down various forms of inquiry, you know, we're going to find what we're looking for. And so, you know, on top of everything else, it's like some kind of matrix that we're in. And so being so careful that, you know, even when we're studying, as Gil was saying, the great open source of nature as a teacher, what is the perception and the patterns of perception that we're looking through? And that affects what we see in nature. I mean, really, for so many decades, people have perceived nature as competitive, right? And then you start to get the work of Lynn Margulis creeping slowly into the world, saying, actually, there's a lot more symbiosis than you think. And so is nature competitive? Is it really all about competition? Or have we, since we had that in our lens, was that what we were seeing? So, you know, it's just not that easy. So for me, I think it's about taking that step back again and again, and not to the point of paralysis. Okay, please don't get me wrong. What I am really in favor of is a kind of rigor here. That this is not some kind of easy peasy, well, man, it's all in the uncertainty, so just go with the flow. No, it's all in the uncertainty, so you got to get down on your hands and knees and work for it. So it's a sort of a slightly different take. Yeah, thank you.
It's in the rigor. All right. Pamela Gordon with Presidio Graduate School. That's the ticking clock I want to ask you both about, is that how do we balance the backing up and asking and feeling and intersteeping, which I really get. It's challenging my analytical left brain side, but I get it. But how do we deal with the ticking clock?
Backing up, Pam, doesn't imply stopping or waiting till you have it all figured out, neatly tied up in a ribbon and a bow. Backing up is what you do in every moment, in every conversation. It could just be like, a microsecond of, where am I now? How does my body feel? What am I hearing from you and feeling from you? And all the many things that we've talked about in this conversation, it's real time. It has to be. And there may be times also in that for pause and for moments of inaction or periods of stepping back, whether it's a Sabbath or a sabbatical, or just a walk in the woods. I've started shifting having my business meetings from at a desk or at a video terminal to being a walk somewhere outdoors with my business partner. And it's remarkable just what that tiny little action, what impact that has on the kind of conversations we have. So this is available always.
I think that the consequences and the consequences of not taking that time, we really don't have time for. So it's sort of, for me, it's about wait until you have that, that thing of the wigs, right? When you find something that's like that, then do. But if you're still just doing direct correctives to a complex problem, you're off course. So just try not to do too much damage until you find the wider processes. That's my take on it. But I just don't think we have time not to. No. So we have to make sense in new ways so that we can respond in new ways.
Unfortunately, we don't have that much more time at the moment. We've reached the point in our program where there's just time for one last question.
Okay. I'm Matthew Schutte, a surfer, shower singer, sometimes poet, and explainer of a project called Holochain. So often we're tempted to come into alignment in order to improve our ability to respond to the challenges we face, or we try to come into alignment. Nora, your criticism of mapping the system, the dots and lines, seems to be anchored in the distilling down of the richness of what is actually happening in that system through the perspective of the mapper. Mm-hmm. And thus there is a loss of all the different ways of perceiving that observer doesn't have access to. Can you comment on the value of difference or of multiple perspectives in the functioning of intelligent systems and in the role of difference in intelligence more generally?
Yeah. Great question. So, of course, basic second-order cybernetics is observing the observer. And if you start to observe the observer, what you're doing is actually engaging in looking for warm data. That's a relationship. Mm-hmm. What's the relationship between the observer and what's being observed? And when you start to do that across multiple perspectives, you're going to start to see that there's different possibilities. And in those differences, there are relationships. Again, another level of warm data. So let's look at a family. Okay, you could ask, say a psychotherapist comes into a family and it's a big family and the psychotherapist is from a small family. And the first thing the psychotherapist observes is that there's a lot of chaos in this family, right? But another person might observe something very different. And does that mean that the family is chaotic, or is the family not chaotic, right? It's about the relationship between the observer and what they're observing. And if you ask the children, one of the children is going to say, have their own observations about the family. The mother will have her observations about the family. And when you start to look at how these different observations are in relationship to each other, that's where these differences can begin to form a kind of, that thing, the moire patterns, where you take screens and you put them over each other and another pattern emerges. You can start to see completely new levels of kinds of information that you didn't see before. Because it isn't just what the mother says or the psychotherapist says or the child says. It's in the relationship between those different descriptions. And those descriptions need to be multiple also at the level of tone and texture. Okay? Not just a professional description. How about a drawing? How about a story? How about photographs or family history, or even you can have numerical descriptions of whatever you need to have, but be sure that there's multiple textures, multiple perceptions, multiple versions, and then whatever it is gonna come bubbling out of those ways that stuff crosses. And for me, the big task there is just to actually just have faith. You will find those places, but not if you don't allow the combinations and the harmonies and the discords to start generating. Yep. Thank you.
Again, I want to thank Nora Bateson and Gil Friend so much for being here and their comments today. We also thank our audience here at the club, as well as our radio audience. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California is adjourned, celebrating 100 years of enlightened discussion. Thank you all for coming.